December 25, 1945. 11:47 a.m. An internment facility outside Medicine Hat, Alberta. The mess hall doors opened to pine boughs and candles. Real candles, wax melting slowly in glass holders salvaged from somewhere, their flames steady in the still air. The smell hit first: roasting turkey, cinnamon, something sweet baking that made your mouth water and your chest tighten because it smelled like memory, like before, like Christmas when Christmas still meant something. 43 women stood at the threshold, uncertain. They'd been told to come for Christmas dinner. But Christmas in captivity seemed like a contradiction. A holiday about peace celebrated by prisoners of war, a feast day for people who'd been eating rations for months. A Canadian sergeant stood by the serving line, not quite smiling but not quite stern either. He spoke in careful German. "Merry Christmas. Please sit anywhere." One woman, Helga, a former clerk from Hamburg, whispered to the woman beside her, "This can't be real." But it was. The tables were set with actual tablecloths, white, clean, pressed. There were place settings. Proper plates, not tin mesh trays. Cutlery that matched. And at the center of each table, small sprigs of evergreen tied with red ribbon. "I thought it was a dream," Helga would write weeks later. Or a trick. Or my mind finally breaking from the strangeness of everything. But it was real. They had made Christmas for us. For us. They expected subsistence. They got celebration. And in that impossible gap, something frozen began to thaw. The moment arrives with the weight of all accumulated loss pressing against unexpected grace. December 1945. The war had been over for 7 months, but Germany was still starving, still in ruins, still processing the magnitude of what had been lost and what had been done. The women who'd been transported to Canada as internees, auxiliary personnel captured in the war's final weeks, had spent months in a kind of limbo. Not quite prisoners of war. Not quite free. Just women waiting to be repatriated to a country that no longer quite existed. They were Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Stabshelferinnen, signals operators and administrative staff who'd kept Wehrmacht communications functioning until there was no Wehrmacht left. When Canadian forces swept through northwestern Germany in April and May, they'd found these women in abandoned offices, evacuated command posts, bunkers where they'd been left behind when officers fled. Most had surrendered without resistance. They had nowhere else to go. The Geneva Convention was ambiguous about their status. They'd worn uniforms, lived in military barracks, followed orders. But they weren't soldiers. The Canadians classified them as civilian internees and applied adapted POW protocols. Detention, documentation, humane treatment pending repatriation. What they hadn't expected, what none of them had imagined, was Christmas dinner. The preparation had begun days earlier, though the women didn't know it. The camp commandant, Major Walsh from Vancouver, a lawyer in peacetime, had put in a request through channels. Special rations for Christmas Day. Turkey if available. Vegetables. Dessert. Decorations. Not luxuries exactly. Just acknowledgement that December 25th meant something, even in an internment camp, even for the defeated. The request went up the chain and came back approved. Canadian military surplus stores could provide turkey, canned vegetables, flour for baking. The camp kitchen staff, supplemented by local volunteers from Medicine Hat, had worked through Christmas Eve preparing the meal. At 10 a.m. on Christmas morning, the camp's Protestant chaplain conducted a brief service. Voluntary attendance, hymns in English and German, a short sermon about peace that carefully avoided politics. Then came the announcement: Christmas dinner would be served at noon in the mess hall. The women had expected regular rations. Maybe a slightly larger portion to acknowledge the holiday. What they found when they entered the mess hall was something else entirely. The hall had been transformed. Pine boughs hung along the walls, cut from trees on nearby land, tied with whatever ribbon the staff could find. Candles and improvised holders cast warm light that made the space feel almost intimate despite its institutional size. Someone had hung paper decorations, simple cutouts, stars and bells, the kind children make in school. They were crude but genuine, evidence of effort and care. The tables were arranged differently than usual, smaller groupings instead of long institutional rows, creating pockets of space that felt less like a mess hall and more like, well, not quite a home but something approaching it. At each place setting sat a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Helga sat down slowly, trying to process the contradiction between what she saw and what she'd expected. Around her, other women did the same, settling into chairs, touching the tablecloths tentatively, examining the evergreen sprigs as if they might vanish if looked at too directly. The Canadian staff began serving. Not harsh. Not performative. Just serving food the way you'd serve any meal, except the food kept coming. Turkey carved into proper portions. Mashed potatoes with gravy. Carrots. Cranberry sauce. Bread rolls. And then, impossibly, pie. Apple pie, still warm, with a crust that flaked properly because someone had taken the time to make it right. Helga stared at her plate. It held more food than she'd seen in a single meal in 2 years. Real food, prepared food, food that someone had spent time making taste good rather than just providing calories. She picked up her fork. Her hands shook. Around her, others were crying, silent tears running down faces while they ate, while they tried to reconcile the abundance in front of them with the deprivation they'd learned to accept as normal. I took one bite of turkey, Helga wrote, and I said out loud to no one in particular, "This is heaven." And I meant it. Not because the food was extraordinary, though it was good, but because someone had cared enough to make it. That caring felt like resurrection. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. After the meal came the packages. Each woman opened hers to find small items, practical things mostly. A bar of soap. A comb. Writing paper and a pencil. A small chocolate bar. Nothing extravagant. Just the basics wrapped carefully, individually, with attention. But tucked into each package was something else. A Christmas card. Simple, printed, with a message in German, wishing you peace this Christmas season. From the staff of Medicine Hat Internment Facility. The cards weren't signed. They weren't personal. But they were acknowledgement, official, documented acknowledgement, that the women receiving them were people who deserved recognition of the holiday, that December 25th meant something even in detention, even across the divide of recent enemies. Greta, a former logistics coordinator, held her card and her chocolate bar and wept. Not from gratitude exactly. From the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of being treated like a person worth giving Christmas gifts to when she'd spent months being taught she was worthless, defeated, finished. A Canadian nursing sister, Captain Fraser, who'd been working at the camp since September, approached her table. "Everything all right?" Greta nodded, unable to speak. Fraser sat down. Not close. Maintaining proper distance. "First Christmas away from home?" Greta found her voice. "First Christmas, like this. First Christmas that felt like Christmas since before the war. It's just dinner. And some small things. Nothing special. It's everything." Fraser was quiet for a moment. "You're not home. You're not with family. But you're here. And here we mark Christmas. That's important. For you, yes. But also for us. If we stop marking it, if we stop acknowledging that days matter, that traditions matter, then we've let the war take something it shouldn't be allowed to take." She made kindness sound like defiance, Greta wrote. Not charity but resistance. They were maintaining Christmas not for us but against what the war had tried to do to everyone. That we benefited was almost incidental. That made it more powerful, not less. The policy behind this Christmas dinner was encoded in military regulations that Canada followed carefully. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoners of war were entitled to practice their religion and observe their holidays. For Christian internees, that included Christmas. But the convention said nothing about the scale or quality of observance. It didn't require turkey or decorations or wrapped gifts. That came from something else. A Canadian military tradition that predated the war. The idea that Christmas was sacred, that it transcended politics and conflict, that maintaining it properly was a matter of national character. Canadian military camps, even in wartime, observed Christmas. The fact that some of those camps now held enemy internees didn't change the obligation. Security through stability. Diplomatic precedent through humane treatment. Moral integrity through maintained traditions. The triad that shaped everything. The afternoon brought unexpected freedom. After dinner, the women were told they had the rest of the day as free time. No work details, no mandatory activities, just time to rest, to write letters, to process. Some gathered in the recreation barracks where someone had organized carol singing. The camp chaplain led, but it wasn't quite a religious service, just singing. Silent Night in German and English, the melodies overlapping awkwardly but genuinely. O Tannenbaum. Hark the herald angels sing. Others walked the camp perimeter, supervised, yes, but given space. The prairie winter was cold but clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens on winter afternoons. Some women had never seen landscape like this. The flatness, the vastness, the way the horizon seemed to curve with the earth's shape. Margaret walked with 2 other internees, their breath visible in the cold air. They didn't talk much. Just walked, processing the strangeness of Christmas in captivity in Canada, in a world that had inverted every expectation. "Do you think they do this every year?" one woman asked. "Christmas like this?" "I think they do it because it's Christmas," Margaret said. "Not because we're here. We just happen to be here when they do it." "Does that make it better or worse?" "I don't know. Both maybe." "We were incidental to their Christmas," Margaret wrote. "They would have observed it regardless. But being incidental felt better than being special. It meant we were people who happened to be present during Christmas, not prisoners who were being rewarded or manipulated." That authenticity mattered. Ilse had been a radio operator, 26 years old, who'd spent the final year of the war in a bunker monitoring Allied transmissions. She'd been good at her job, quick, accurate, able to maintain focus through bombardments. She'd surrendered when the bunker was overrun, grateful the war had ended for her, whatever came next. At Medicine Hat, she struggled with idleness. Work gave her structure. Christmas Day, with its enforced leisure, left her unmoored. She found herself in the camp library, a converted supply room with donated books, mostly in English but a few in German, trying to read, trying to fill time. A Canadian guard, Private Mitchell from Saskatchewan, was on duty sitting by the door. They'd interacted before during work details. He'd been professional, neither friendly nor harsh. Just present. After an hour of failed reading, Ilse asked, "Do you celebrate Christmas?" "You personally?" Mitchell looked up. "Yeah. With my family, usually. My mom makes turkey. My sisters fight about who makes better pie. My dad drinks too much and falls asleep in his chair. Normal Christmas things. And this year you're here. With us. Someone's got to be on duty. I volunteered. Figured guys with kids should get the day off." "That's kind." Mitchell shrugged. "It's practical. I don't have kids." "They do." Made sense. They sat in silence. Then Ilse said, "Thank you. For the dinner. For making it nice." "Wasn't me. Was the kitchen staff. The commandant. The people who organized it. Still, thank you for being here. For not making it worse than it has to be." "He accepted my thanks without deflecting," Ilse wrote. "Just, 'You're welcome,' and went back to his post." That simplicity, no speech about humanity or reconciliation, just acknowledgement, meant more than eloquence could have. The transformation that Christmas Day brought wasn't immediate or complete. It didn't erase months of fear, of propaganda internalized, of trauma accumulated. But it created a crack, a small opening where light could enter. Women who'd been withdrawn began talking more during meals, began participating in the evening activities, language classes, music groups, the small social structures that emerged in any long-term confinement. The Christmas cards were kept, treasured, tucked into bundles of possessions even though they said nothing personal. They were evidence, official, documented evidence, that someone had thought they deserved Christmas. One woman, Anna, a clerk, pinned hers above her bunk. When another internee asked why, she said, "So I remember that even here, even defeated, I'm still human enough to receive Christmas wishes." That seems important to remember. New Year's Eve came a week later. No special dinner this time, just regular rations, but the evening recreation time extended. The camp staff organized a dance in the main hall. Music from a radio, space cleared for dancing, guards present but not intrusive. Some women danced together, awkwardly at first, then with more confidence. Others watched, or sat talking, or simply existed in a space where something approaching normalcy was permitted. At midnight, everyone, guards, staff, internees, counted down together in 2 languages and marked the transition to 1946 with subdued acknowledgement that a new year had arrived, whatever it might hold. Captain Fraser found Helga sitting alone, watching the dancing. Not joining? "I don't remember how. To dance. To be normal. To do things just because they're pleasant, not because they're necessary." Fraser nodded. "That's what captivity does. Makes you forget there's a difference between existing and living. You'll remember. Takes time, but you'll remember." She promised nothing, Helga wrote. Just observation that recovery was possible. That was more valuable than false comfort. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. January brought news of repatriation schedules. The women would be sent back to Germany in stages, processed through British occupation facilities, and released into a country most barely recognized. The prospect was terrifying and necessary. They needed to go home, even though home no longer existed in any form that made sense. In the weeks before departure, the camp staff prepared them practically. Information about conditions in Germany. Advice about accessing resources. Documentation they'd need. and, quietly, extra supplies, clothing, toiletries, small amounts of non-perishable food, distributed without ceremony as people packed their few possessions. The night before the first group departed, Major Walsh addressed them in the mess hall. His German was formal, carefully practiced. "You came here as internees. You leave as persons cleared for repatriation. What happens next is up to you. Germany needs rebuilding. That's difficult work, probably harder than anything you experienced here. But it's work that matters. You've shown you can work well when treated fairly. Remember that. Expect that. Demand that. You deserve it." It wasn't sentiment. It was instruction. Practical advice delivered with the assumption that they had agency, that their futures were their own to shape. "He didn't forgive us," Greta wrote. "Didn't absolve us. Just treated us like competent people who could handle truth." That respect, being spoken to like adults with agency, was the greatest gift he could have given. The departure came on a February morning, snow falling softly, the kind that makes the world quiet. The women boarded buses that would take them to trains, then to ships, then to a Germany they might not recognize. Before boarding, each received a final package from the camp administration. Inside, a condensed medical summary in German, a list of resources in the British occupation zone, a reference letter confirming they'd been interned at Medicine Hat and had completed their detention without incident, and one more thing, a photograph. It showed the mess hall on Christmas Day. The pine boughs, the candles, the decorated tables. It had been taken by the camp's administrative photographer, copied, and distributed to each woman as a memento. On the back, written in English and German, "Christmas 1945, Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada." Helga held her photograph, her medical summary, her reference letter. The documentary evidence of months that had transformed from terror to strange normalcy to something approaching peace. She boarded the bus carrying proof that she'd been seen, been documented, been treated as human even in defeat. What happened to them after is scattered through letters, records, and reconstruction. Helga returned to Hamburg, found her family's apartment destroyed, and worked for British Occupation Services as a translator. She emigrated to Toronto in 1950, married a Canadian veteran, and raised 3 children. The Christmas photograph stayed on her dresser until her death in 1998. When her daughter asked about it, she said, "That's the Christmas I remembered I was still human. That matters." Greta went to Munich, rebuilt, married in 1948 and raised 4 children. She worked as a bookkeeper and kept her Christmas card in her desk drawer for 50 years. In a 1995 interview she said, "They gave us Christmas when they didn't have to. That gift, that choice to maintain tradition even toward enemies, showed me that civilization could survive the worst. I've tried to live by that principle ever since." Margaret stayed in the British zone, married a British civil servant, moved to Wales and worked as a school secretary. She kept her photograph in a family album, labeled simply, "Christmas in Canada, 1945. Her children grew up knowing that their mother had been a prisoner who'd been given Christmas dinner by her captors, and that this had mattered in ways they didn't fully understand but respected. Ilse returned to Berlin, found it divided, and spent decades working in communications. She never married. She kept Private Mitchell's name written in an address book, though she never had an address to send anything to. Just the name, preserved, a reminder that decency had names and faces. The story does not end with redemption because Christmas dinner doesn't erase complicity or balance moral accounts. These women didn't earn their turkey through virtue or transform through cranberry sauce. They simply experienced a day when their captors chose to maintain tradition even toward the defeated, and that choice created space for something new. 70 years later, a historian researching Canadian POW facilities interviewed descendants of camp staff. One woman, whose grandfather had been a cook at Medicine Hat, remembered his stories. Did he resent it? The historian asked. Making Christmas dinner for German prisoners when Canadians were still rationing? The woman smiled. Grandpa said Christmas wasn't negotiable. You celebrated it properly or you didn't celebrate it at all. The fact that some of the people celebrating were prisoners didn't change the obligation. If anything, it made it more important. Maintaining Christmas, doing it right with real effort, was how you proved that the war hadn't destroyed what mattered. The prisoners benefiting was almost beside the point. It was about who we were, not about who they were. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The mess hall doors that opened to pine boughs and candles on December 25, 1945, echoed through decades. They opened not onto forgiveness or reconciliation. Those were too large, too complicated, too freighted with questions about who had the right to grant what. They opened onto something simpler and more durable. The recognition that Christmas meant something, that tradition mattered even in detention, that maintaining civilization required maintaining its rituals even toward those who tried to destroy it. The Canadian staff who decorated that hall, who cooked that dinner, who distributed those small packages made no speeches about humanity. They simply observed Christmas the way Christmas should be observed. With care, with tradition, with acknowledgement that December 25th required more than regular rations. That the people observing it were prisoners was incidental to the obligation. But being incidental made it profound. Because it meant the Christmas wasn't contingent on the women's behavior or attitude or transformation. It simply was. It would have happened regardless. They just happened to be present, and being present meant being included. The war had taught these women to expect degradation in defeat. Christmas 1945 in a mess hall in Alberta decorated with pine boughs and candles, taught them something harder. That civilization maintained its traditions not from weakness but from strength. That decency toward enemies was not compromise but principle. That turkey and pie served in an internment camp could be both ordinary observance and extraordinary grace. They expected subsistence. They got celebration. And in that gap between what defeat entitled and what tradition required, they discovered that even in captivity, even in defeat, even in a world that had tried to destroy everything, Christmas still came. Still mattered. Still transformed an ordinary mess hall into something that felt, for one impossible day, like heaven. The war had taught them fear. Christmas taught them that some things survived even total war. That traditions maintained became lifelines. That ordinary observance, applied with genuine effort, became extraordinary mercy. That saying Merry Christmas to prisoners was not weakness but the insistence that some things, some days, some traditions, some remnants of civilization, remained sacred even when everything else had fallen.